Well, hey there, everyone. Welcome into another episode of the Winsome Creationist. I'm pleased that you would decide to join us and take the time to listen to this episode. My name's Steve, if you're kind of new around here, and this is the podcast where we talk about creationism, and we're actually nice. We're not mean. We don't think you're a compromiser if you disagree, and we're way more interested in building the creation model than in tearing down evolution. We think evolution's wrong. But we also think that creation is true. We're way more interested in showing how creation is true and the Bible is correct than we are talking about why we don't like evolution. So this time we're going to be answering a listener question, and the gentleman's name is Ravi. Now, most of our comments that we get on YouTube are kind of rough. This one wasn't. I don't know. I mean, he asked it in a way that didn't sound rough, but as we analyze the question, I mean, it kind of is rough. So we're gonna look at this together, and I think it'll be something useful. Again, one of the things that I want to continue talking about here on the podcast is how do we answer people's questions. Asking questions isn't a bad thing. Sometimes people come to us with really, really good questions, and we ought to have a good answer for them, I think. And we ought to not just talk about the details of creation, the science, or even the biblical text, but we also need to talk about what we're talking about, right? Talk about how we're talking about what we're talking about. And that is going to be a little bit about what this episode touches on. Okay. So here we go. So Ravi asks this question: how do you guys respond to the fact that the vast majority of Christians are evolutionists and that there are no non-religious converts to creationism? If the evidence is so strong, surely someone who isn't a believer would be convinced. There are, however, millions of theistic evolutionists. Okay. That was the question. Now, there's a lot packed into that question, and so therefore a lot that we need to unpack. So there's multiple layers to Ravi's question. And look, it's a good question. I think it's a good question. What I would encourage you to do is to pause this podcast, whether you are listening on audio or watching on video. Just hit pause real quick and consider how you might answer this question before continuing. Because that's part of the goal, right? Again, let's say that somebody at church asked you that question. It's a good question. Okay, how would you actually answer this question? Did you do it? Did you pause the podcast? Are you back now? If you didn't, shame on you. Or as my little girl, Tilly, she's a sweetheart. She's 4 years old. She says, "How shame of you, Daddy." Anyway, so funny. Yeah, if you didn't answer that question, maybe do it now, pause now, and really try to answer this. If not, okay, keep listening on, and we are going to sort of break it down and go from there. So when I hear this question, how do you guys respond to the fact that the vast majority of Christians are evolutionists and that there are no religious converts to creationism? I hear what in logic we call a complex question. Okay. And what a complex question is it's a question that's either intentionally or unintentionally intended to confuse, because there are assumptions baked in to the very asking of the question that may or may not be true. And so the only way to unravel a complex question is to ask questions of the questioner to get to the bottom of their viewpoint. Okay. So the first question that comes up is this: well, actually, are the vast majority of Christians evolutionists? Are they? Now, this is a good question, too, that we need to ask. And if I were having a conversation back and forth with Ravi, here's how I might tackle that. I might say, well, Ravi, that's a really good question, and I appreciate it. I'd love to give you the best answer that I possibly can. Let me ask you a question. How did you find out that most Christians are evolutionists? And then let him answer. Okay. Now, maybe Ravi doesn't have an answer. And here's the thing: you are under no obligation to answer any question at any point in time, but you're certainly under no obligation to ask a question that has been asked by somebody who's not informed about the nature of the question themselves. Does that make sense? So if you ask Ravi that question back, well, actually, are the vast majority of Christians evolutionists? I'm not sure about that. Where did you get that data? Let them provide it. And maybe he has that data, and then you say, oh, okay, would you mind sending me that? I'd actually like to take a look at that for myself. Okay. as I did research on this question, because I actually thought it was a great question, it's hard to know. It's really hard to know. As of 2019 in America, 40% of Gallup poll respondents were creationists, like 6-day creationists. Okay, 2019, that's 5 years ago. Gallup poll respondents of Americans, 40% were creationists. And quote, more Americans continue to think that humans evolved over millions of years, either with God's guidance, that's 33%, or increasingly without God's involvement at all, 22%, end quote. Now, a couple things about that. Yeah, those numbers are increasing, but did you notice that only 22% of Americans believe the story of naturalism? Isn't that wild to think about? 22% of Americans believe that essentially there was no creator, that evolution just happened. Now, I know that's a larger number than it has been in the past, but it's actually staggering to consider the amount of funding, and I'll just use the word indoctrination because I believe it's true, that has gone into promoting the idea of evolution, and yet only 22% believe in evolution apart from God. And so we have a higher number, 33%, who believe that God used evolution, but that's still less than the 40% of Gallup poll respondents here who said they were creationists, like 6-day, 6,000-year-old Earth creationists. Now, of course, this is just in America, okay? And so worldwide, these numbers might look a lot different. I wasn't able to find any information, though, on this same question being asked in a worldwide context, okay? So, now, it helps if you're armed with this information so that when you're having a conversation with Ravi back and forth, even though you don't maybe tell him everything that you know, you don't have to show your hand, you at least have that in your back pocket as a discussion point. So I'm glad that Ravi asked the question because if I ever am in a conversation about this just in my real life, I'm going to now be armed with this data and I can ask them that question. Well, how do you know that most people are evolutionists, most Christians are evolutionists, and not creationists? Now, for the sake of argument and for continuing to answer this question, given the truth of what Ravi has claimed here with his question, let's say that, the vast majority of Christians are evolutionists. That very well could be if you were to conduct this poll worldwide. Okay, let's say the vast majority are evolutionists. Well, if that's the case, then you've got more questions that you need to ask. So one question would be this: are they evolutionists by default? And or is it because of indoctrination? Okay, so is the reason that they're evolutionists because they were never taught the story of creation, or is it because they actually went out and did field work themselves and did an intense study to try to prove this wrong or prove this right? Did they go talk to professors and get an in-depth view of the evolutionary process and compare that against a robust view of the current creation model that we have and actually weigh the evidence back and forth? Or was it because they were just indoctrinated to believe this and never had any real reason to question it? So they're either evolutionists by default, they've never been taught anything different, or they were indoctrinated into believing it by showing just one side of the evidence and not giving any consideration to the other. Or did they do an investigation and actually come to believe it because of the evidence? Did they actually look hard at the evidence and talk to the best representatives of both sides and then come away from that thinking, evolution has the goods and creation doesn't? Okay, so that's another thing that you have to ask. Okay, we don't just win by majority. Okay, there have been times in the past, plenty of times, where the scientific majority has been wrong. So science is not a game of the majority wins. So I disagree with the premise of the question that Ravi has asked here. I disagree with the premise of, well, how do you guys respond to the fact, as if that some response is needed, that most of the world are evolutionists or that even most Christians are evolutionists? Just because they're evolutionists doesn't mean that it's true. Okay. And so that is basically how I respond to that. So then let's move to the next part of the question. Okay. Are there no non-religious converts to creationism? In other words, are there people who are not religious but looked at the evidence for creationism and said, wow, yeah, I believe that now, and so I'm going to be a creationist? Now, once again, it's very actually hard to know this. Ravi claimed that there are no, which is an absolute case, there are no non-religious converts to creationism. I don't think that's true. I am aware of some articles, and I think CMI, Creation Ministries International, has done a fairly good job of cataloging a few of these. I believe there are actually some people who were essentially non-religious converts to creationism. In other words, they checked this out. They did the investigation for themselves, and then they later on came to accept the truth of the Bible, because it turned out that the Bible's claim of science was more accurate than the evolutionary claim of science. Way of understanding science. So I know of many who came to be at least theists or intelligent design advocates based on the evidence, for sure. There's many of those examples out there, but I don't have a specific story to tell you of people who became like a young earth creationist because of it, although I do think that that Creation Ministries International may have some of that categorized. But still, the point here is, notice that Ravi has just assumed it in his question. Are there no non-religious, why are there no non-religious converts to creationism? Well, we don't know that there's non-religious converts to creationism. We know for sure that there's non-religious converts to other views like intelligent design and theistic evolution, indeed. And then we do know, of course, from there, of some people who began that way and then took a harder look at the evidence for creationism and became creationists. So we definitely know that this path happens, even though it may be rare and it may be a little bit longer of a journey. So I'm going to disagree pretty hard with Ravi on the assumptions that went into his initial question. All right, so here's another piece of it. If the evidence is so strong, surely someone who isn't a believer would be convinced. If the evidence is so strong, surely someone who isn't a believer would be convinced. This is another assumption that Ravi has baked into the question. What he's baked into the question is the fact that it's evidence that will ultimately convince somebody to move from one position to another. Now, I get where Ravi is coming with this, and I appreciate that. And as someone who's learned to embrace the intellectual side of things, of life, frankly, in the past 10 years or so, and especially the intellectual exploration of Christianity, I would like to think that most people make their decisions very rationally and very logically. Unfortunately, the researchers in cognitive fields and in psychology would very much disagree. Okay, I learned this because I am simultaneously, as I've taken a more intellectual dive into my faith and into science and things like that. On the other hand, I run a marketing business. And so when you run a marketing business, you learn a lot about people and how they make decisions. And one of the things that you learn is that people make decisions emotionally, and then they justify that decision using logic. So very many of our decisions that we make as humans are made in a split second before we have very many details. And then our brains do their best to logically justify the decision that has been emotionally made, and that's where things like confirmation bias come in. So it's not clear to me at all then, as somebody who studies human beings, frankly, as a marketer, that if the evidence is strong enough, someone who is a believer would be convinced, okay? I think it's much more likely that this is primarily a worldview issue and not an evidence issue at all. Now, if there was absolutely no evidence, surely most people wouldn't be creationists. But that's where there's always this interesting divide. Creationists claim there's no evidence for evolution. Evolutionists claim there's no evidence for creationism. And people who say that on both sides are ignorant to the worldview issue. In fact, the reason they're saying that is because it's a worldview issue. Okay, they don't understand that there's more than one way, more than one worldview lens to look at the evidence through and interpret the evidence on either side. So Evolutionists and creationists look at the same data in the real world and come to different conclusions about that data. So there's more than one way to view the evidence. And again, like I said, sort of, if you will, to use the word fundamentalist, creationists and evolutionists usually have in common that they don't really see it this way. They think evolutionists are off their rocker, the creationists do, and the evolutionists think the creationists are off their rocker, and that's just not how the world works. I really wouldn't expect someone to just look at the evidence and determine that the earth was young and that now they should therefore be a creationist, because they just have no reason to look at the evidence from that viewpoint at all, okay? Might as well just be an evolutionist. It's just fine. It's not hurting anything. So I wouldn't expect an evolutionist to become a creationist. They have a way of explaining the evidence in their worldview. I think they do a good job of it, and that's that. So you might ask, and he didn't ask this, but you might ask, well, why wouldn't you just be a theistic evolutionist? It seems like you get the best of both worlds. And again, I mean no disrespect to my theistic evolutionist brothers and sisters, although I think they're wrong on this. Ultimately, that's an internal question among Christians that comes down to, number one, how you interpret the Bible, and number two, what you think the relationship of the Bible and scientific evidence is, okay? The nature of that relationship and the nature of the Bible in general and interpretations of it, those are inside baseball. Those are questions among Christians that we disagree on, and I think evolution, whether or not a Christian believes in evolution, is ultimately going to come down to how a Christian also thinks about the Bible as it relates to science. I'm not saying that a theistic evolutionist is only a theistic evolutionist because of not because of the evidence, or like only because of how they understand the Bible. Yeah, they absolutely look at the scientific evidence too. They just don't see what the Bible provides any sort of limitation or hindrance or constraint from the age of the earth perspective, and so they don't apply that to their scientific thinking at all, and so no reason to buck up against the majority of the scientific believing world on that, okay? And so obviously there's going to be individual cases here and there with different people, but for the most part, I think what I'm saying most people would consider accurate. Okay, and then finally, he says there are millions of theistic evolutionists. Okay, true. There are also millions of creationists, okay? And just to remind you, number one, the majority is not always right. We talked about that already, okay? It's not about a majority game, okay? And yet, number two, the majority of Christians throughout the centuries have been creationists. This is now an undeniable fact, okay? The majority of Christians for the past 2,000 years, and the Jewish before them, have been 6-day creationists. Okay, yes, there were questions a little bit prior to the 1700s, but really it was only after the 1700s and the introduction of uniformitarianism and deep time that people began to depart more regularly from that sort of traditional creationist view of the Christian faith. And this is just a matter of and record of history. Okay, this is not something that's debatable at this point. And then third and finally, it is a fact of history that scientific evolutionary thinking has been fundamentally anti-Christian in its pursuits. Let me state that one more time. It's a fact of history that scientific evolutionary thinking has been fundamentally anti-Christian in its pursuits. Read the work of Darwin, okay? It's no coincidence that most, or at least many, of the academic evolutionists were racists and eugenicists, okay? Yes, of course, most evolutionists today want to totally distance themselves from that, okay? But there's something very pure in that connection of the past. It was a very logical connection for those early evolutionary scientists to make. So, yeah, I mean, the fact is that even if, yes, you can be a theistic evolutionist now and be totally distanced from all that. I completely get it. I'm not calling you a boogeyman. I'm just saying is that it's hard to deny if you look at the history of scientific evolutionary thinking, it has in many ways been fundamentally anti-Christian. Okay, and so that's just an unfortunate fact of history. Okay, so again, Ravi asked a good question, but it had so many layers baked in there that at least half, probably more, of his question, I think, is based on somewhat unprovable assumptions, and much of the rest of what was said, I'm just not sure it's true. And I'm not sure if that's really the way that the world works and the way that people's minds work when it comes to thinking about the creation and evolution issue. So thanks for the question, Ravi. I hope it's something that I hope you listen to this or watch this and you could get something from it. I hope those of you who were listening and watching otherwise were able to get something from not just my specific answers to that question, but the way that I unpacked the question and handled the different aspects of it. And I hope that that's something that you can use as instructive in your own efforts. All right, that's it for this episode. God bless. Look forward to seeing you next time here on the Winsome Creationist. See you later.